Denmark, West Germany and India were mondialized, mondial, that's the world in French, or announced themselves as world territory by mid-1951. 43. World Movement for World Federal Government, WMWFG. A coalition of World Federalist organizations was established in Switzerland in 1947 under the name World Movement for World Federal Government, WMWFG. By 1950, the movement claimed 56 member groups in 22 countries, with some 150,000 members. The movement could not agree on tactics. The minimalists, mostly Americans, sought a world government with powers limited to preventing war. The United World Federalists aimed to strengthen the UN for this purpose. The maximalists, mostly Europeans and from elsewhere, favoured greater powers for the world body. Some favoured the establishment of regional bodies first, and the main advocates of a united Europe soon formed their own organisations and had little to do with the WMWFG thereafter. Osborne's crusade for world government proposed direct popular elections to send delegates to a People's World Convention. Gary David insisted on keeping his world citizens entirely independent. Despite the internal disagreements, popular support was strong. Opinion polls organised by UNESCO in 1948 and 1949 showed that world government was favoured by a majority of people in 6 countries: France, Italy, Holland, Norway, West Germany and Britain. That is, nearly all of Europe, and rejected only 3 countries: Australia, Mexico, US. Parliamentary groups supporting world federalism numbered 100 members in Sweden, 110 members in Japan, including the Prime Minister, 200 in France and nearly 300 in Italy. The constitutions of France, Italy, the Netherlands and West Germany were all amended to permit limitations on national sovereignty for the purpose of joining a regional or world federation. This surge of interest led to great results with the unification of Europe, but to little else on the global scale, before it was overtaken by the onset of the Cold War. 44. The onset of the Cold War. Ideological differences on who should own capital between communist USSR and capitalist US led to rivalry for power and influence in the world. Churchill spoke in 1946 of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. The Berlin airlift by the Americans took place in 1948 when the Soviets blocked off Berlin. In 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. As a result of all these events, fear of communism in the US reached fever pitch, leading to the paranoia of the McCarthy era. The Americans then relied on nuclear weapons strategically. They were unwilling to match the manpower of the Red Army on the ground, so used the threat of nuclear weapons if the Soviets attacked Western Europe. After the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb, the US then decided to develop their hydrogen, that is fusion bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the uranium fission bomb. Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Los Alamos project, opposed this decision, arguing that it would lead to a new and terrible arms race in thermonuclear weapons. But his protests were dismissed by President Truman. The first H-bomb was exploded in 1952 that obliterated an entire island 1 mile in diameter and left a huge crater on the ocean floor. The communists had their own version of the peace movement. They were fearful that the capitalists, as predicted by Lenin, would attempt to crush them by armed force. So the peace movement was seen by them as a brake, that's B-R-A-K-E, to use against such an attempt. They sponsored the World Peace Council in 1950. Under state sponsorship, petitions for peace obtained hundreds of millions of signatures in the East. This communist-capitalist rivalry had the unfortunate effect of labelling the peace organisations in the West as communist fronts. The World Federalists were getting fire from both sides. The Soviets opposed the idea of world government, calling it a plot of imperialist forces which aspire to world domination. The Daughters of the American Revolution, on the other hand, charged that world federalism was the key to Russian domination of America. The Chicago Tribune claimed that the movement was led by dangerous liberals and radicals, and behind them were veteran followers of the Communist Party line. The result was that the peace movement collapsed as the Korean War progressed. All but 8 of the US states that had previously resolved to support world government had voted to rescind those resolutions by June 1951. The People's World Convention, organised by Henry Osborne in 1951, was a fiasco. Gary Davis gave up his campaign and went home to the US. He later wrote a book, The World is My Country. There are now over 1 million world citizens living in more than 105 different countries. Enthusiasm also dwindled amongst the scientists. Many went back to their classrooms or labs. The emergency committee was disbanded in 1951. Teller, with his Hungarian background, became a staunch Cold Warrior and director of the H-bomb project. Oppenheimer fell under suspicion for his opposition to the project and was stripped of his government posts. Linus Pauling, the double Nobel chemist and Peace Prize winner, maintained his opposition to nuclear weapons. The Russian Andrei Sakharov, father of the Soviet H-bomb, later became passionately opposed to such weapons and suffered internal exile for his beliefs. Albert continued his work for peace and world government until his death in 1955. A week before he died, he signed with Bertrand Russell and others a famous manifesto. "Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war?" This led to the foundation of the Pugwash movement, which organizes high-level conference on science and world affairs and aims to reduce the danger of nuclear war. The World Federalist movement was affected badly by the Cold War. Federalist schemes were clearly impractical while the confrontation between the two superpowers continued, so it became only a small thread of the broader disarmament movement from then on. 45. The Cold War and the Nuclear Arms Race. The nuclear arms race continued through the 1950s, with the Soviets exploding their first H-bomb in 1953. The main strategy was based on deterrence. The first period of mass protests against nuclear weapons did not occur until the late 1950s, when people became concerned with radioactive fallout. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Armament CND, was founded in Britain in 1958 by Bertrand Russell and others. Due to such public pressure, the US and Soviet governments began to negotiate a ban on atmospheric nuclear testing. In 1962, the two nuclear powers confronted each other over the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they came closer than ever to nuclear war. Frightened by this experience, they created a partial test ban treaty. In the 1960s, a different kind of arms race took place, namely with ballistic missiles. The US was shocked by the success of the USSR putting the world's first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit, which implied that they were ahead in the missile technology race. President Kennedy aimed to catch up by making his "Man on the Moon by the end of the decade" speech. This goal was achieved in July 1969. The Vietnam War soured relations between the superpowers even further. A major step in arms control occurred when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968 to control the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons to nations other than the 5 nuclear powers at the time, that is, US, USSR, UK, France and China. During this time, the stockpiles of nuclear weapons reached frightening proportions. The strategic doctrine was MAD, M-A-D, Mutual Assured Destruction. The reasoning was that as long as each superpower knew it would be devastated by the other in the event of a nuclear war, then neither of them would dare to start such a war. A very stable posture of mutual deterrence would be achieved between the two nations, and so peace between them would be preserved. This doctrine could be summarized as, "Don't do that, or I'll kill us both." In 1972, after the Vietnam War concluded, further important agreements were made. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, placed an upper limit on the number of missiles on each side. Similar restrictions were imposed in the 1970s. In the 1980s, tensions between the US and USSR grew again due to such factors as the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the deployment of new missile systems in Europe, and the presence of hardliner Ronald Reagan in the US presidency. At their peak, the arsenals of the two superpowers numbered more than 50,000 warheads, that is 3 to 4 tons of TNT per person on the Earth. In World War II, it took only 1 ton of TNT on average to kill one person. Combined with the effects of radioactive fallout and a nuclear winter, where the sun's rays are blocked from the dust in the atmosphere generated by the nuclear explosions, resulting in crop failure and mass starvation. The results would have been the worst catastrophe ever to befall human civilization, with deaths numbering in the hundreds of millions. The citizens of Europe were placed in a difficult situation. Intermediate-range missiles were deployed on both sides of the Iron Curtain, with a range of only a few hundred kilometers, reducing the warning time to about 7 minutes. This in turn necessitated an automatic launch on warning hair-trigger response system. The Europeans found these new and dangerous weapons pointed at their heads from both sides and located on their own territory and having little say in the matter. This resulted in a huge upsurge in the nuclear disarmament movement. Hundreds of thousands of people took part in mass protest marches through the cities of Europe. Enormous pressure built up for the leaders of the superpowers to halt and reverse the unstoppable nuclear arms race. 46. The end of the Cold War. President Reagan began his Star Wars program as a defense system against ballistic missiles that many experts considered impractical. Then in 1985, a breakthrough occurred. Mikhail Gorbachev took over as leader of the USSR, and the Cold War finally thawed. He believed in peace and nuclear disarmament, thus perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness. He achieved rapid results on both fronts. He endorsed the concept of international law in a speech to the UN in 1988, saying, "Our ideal is a world community of states which are based on the rule of law and which subordinate their foreign policy activities to law." The Soviet and the whole communist system then collapsed, leaving the US as the sole superpower. Also, a watershed was reached with nuclear disarmament. The intermediate-range missiles in Europe were removed thanks to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty of 1988. This was the first disarmament measure since World War II. It only affected 4% of the warheads of the time, but was full of promise. Further reduction treaties were implemented in the 1990s. Plans were made to reduce the number of warheads from 10,000 to 3,500 each by the year 2003. A comprehensive test ban treaty, which would forbid virtually all tests of new nuclear weapons, was endorsed by the General Assembly of the UN. When the French began a series of tests in 1995, President Chirac was shocked by the worldwide storm of protests that resulted. The nuclear threat has been substantially reduced in recent years, so that membership in peace societies and disarmament groups has dwindled away again. This does not mean that the problem has disappeared. Both sides still have thousands of missiles. In the meantime, other countries have joined the nuclear club, that is, India, Pakistan, Israel, South Africa, etc. 47. World Federalism during the Cold War. The World Federalist movement reorganized itself after the collapse induced by the Korean War. Henry Osborne and his group formed a World Association of Parliamentarians for World Government, involving lawmakers from 10 countries, which campaigned for a review of the UN Charter but failed. In 1956, the WMWFG relabeled itself to the World Association of World Federalists, WAWF, and later still became the World Federalist Movement. The main body in the US renamed itself the World Federalist Association, WFA, in 1965. WFA branches exist in some 14 other countries, but with rather small memberships. New proposals for world government continue to appear from time to time. In 1958, Clark and Sohn, S-O-H-N, published World Peace Through World Law. This remains the best known of the detailed schemes for World Federation. Hugh Gaitskell, the leader of the British Labour Party in the late 1950s, put forward an 8-point programme for world government. In 1963, Pope John XXIII released an encyclical entitled Pacem in Terris, which means peace on earth, which discussed the need for a supranational organisation to promote the universal common good. New associations to promote world government continue to emerge. The Movement for Political World Union, was founded by Dr. Creighton in Holland in 1969 and gathered members in 50 countries. He published his ideas in a book, International Anarchy, and established an emergency world council as a preparatory step towards a world government. In the US, the group Planetary Citizens was founded in 1970. Its president, Donald Keyes, or Keyes, K-E-Y-S, was the UN representative for the World Association of World Federalists. Planetary Citizens aims to increase people's awareness of their roles as citizens of the planet, and it numbered about 200,000 members in 1980. Academic programs on the subject began to appear. For example, the Institute for International Order began an educational project in 1961 based on discussion of the Clark-Sohn model. The World Order Models Project, WOMP, was established in 1968 under the auspices of Harry Hollins, Hollins, of the World Law Fund. Academic interest in the area has continued to spread ever since, and some discussion of the idea of world government is now found in standard textbooks on international relations and international law all over the world. In 1977, a group called the World Constitution and Parliament Association attempted to short-circuit the stall process of evolution towards a world federation. They held a World Constituent Assembly meeting in Austria, attended by participants from 25 countries, where a draft constitution for the Federation of Earth was adopted and submitted for ratification by individuals and governments around the globe. Some 4 million people have indicated support in the succeeding period, but no governments have yet been persuaded. A World Parliamentary Group was re-established in 1978 in New Zealand. It was originally named Parliamentarians for World Order, later changed to Parliamentarians Global Action. The World Federalist movement sank to a low ebb during the long siege of the Cold War. Membership of the World Federalist Association dropped as low as 5,000, although it had recovered to about 12,000 by 1989. Joseph Baratta, a historian of the movement, commented bleakly in that year, "The ideal of a world federal state has been almost entirely forgotten. The very expression, world government, has fallen out of use." Books on world politics no longer include a chapter on world government as the ultimate goal of some transitional strategy, and the topic has been dropped from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Nevertheless, he discovered published books on world federalism from some 75 nations around the globe, including some 50 different prototype schemes which demonstrate the worldwide appeal of the idea. F. The historical size of political units. Chapter 5 presents the many factors that are pushing towards the creation of a global state. These factors are largely technological. For example, the creation of an internet that is 1 billion times faster than that at the time of writing. But others are more economic, political, social, etc. In this brief section, I introduce just one of those factors to whet your appetite that I believe will make the creation of a global state inevitable this century, and perhaps even by mid-century, given the rate at which these globalization forces are working. The factor is a simple logical historical argument concerned with the size of political units over the broad sweep of human history. By extrapolating this size from the distant past to the near future, one sees that it reaches the size of the whole planet this century, and probably not even into the second half of this century. In a little more detail, the argument proceeds as follows. If one poses a question, quote, why do political units, for example villages, towns, cities, regions, countries, unions, etc., take the size that they do? Then most people will probably mention the impact of technology as being a determinative factor. For example, go back to the European Middle Ages or ancient Roman times and consider the fastest means of transport and the effect that that limit had on the size of possible empires. In those days, the fastest vehicle was the horse, so that a human being could travel about 100 kilometers maximum per day, certainly not 1,000 kilometers per day. Even with high-quality Roman roads that allow Roman legions 2,000 years ago to march fairly quickly by human foot soldier speeds, from one Roman garrison to another, hundreds of kilometers apart. It was simply not practical to create an empire that extended from the west of Europe to the east of Asia. As a result, the Chinese emperors and the Roman emperors were oblivious of each other's existence. The distances separating them were simply too great and required far too much time and effort to link the two. The result was that the two empires existed simultaneously and quite independently. The technologies that existed at the time were simply inadequate to bridge them. Now, let's go to the other extreme and imagine a future technology that is often used in science fiction stories called teleportation, which is capable of reading off the position of every atom in an object, transmitting that information via a radio signal over large distances at the speed of light, then reassembling an exact copy of that object atom by atom, using each atom's positional information obtained from the source. If we assume the original object or person is disassembled at the source and reassembled at the destination, then that disassembly and reassembly is equivalent to transportation. Effectively, the person or object has been moved from point A to point B. Given the speed of this movement, what impact would such a technology have upon the size of political units in the future? It should be obvious to anyone that the impact would be very powerful. Teleportation would make practical the almost instantaneous transportation of people and goods between 2 points in space that are within a distance that light can traverse within a reasonable time. For example, a maximum of days, but normally hours. Teleportation would therefore make a solar system-sized political unit practical. People could be teleported from one planet to another within hours or less. Similarly with goods, so economics could exist over a similar size scale for the same reason. With the speed of light limit, the maximum speed in the humanly known universe, that is about 300,000 kilometers per second, would make interstellar teleportation impractical. It would take about 4 years to teleport anything to the next nearest star besides our Sun. Presumably the destination teleport would also have to be installed at the destination prior to any teleportation. Therefore, given the limitations of the speed of light, no interstellar political unit is conceivable. We would be stuck at the solar system size limit of political units. But of course, we do not yet live in such a teleporting future. We do not have such a miraculous technology that allows atoms to be teleported. Actually, only the positional information of atoms is teleported. So inevitably, the technological limitations on the size of political units must lie between that of the horse and the teleporter. Where are we today in this regard? We have jumbo jets capable of transporting hundreds of people at a time from one continent to another in about half a day. We have telecommunication systems that are worldwide, allowing people in the richer countries to access information with their personal computers from data banks anywhere in the world and at the speed of light. This book will claim that a technological, political, economic, social revolution is currently underway that will allow the size of the political unit to grow beyond what we have been accustomed to for the past century or so. Since the size of the current largest political unit is the Union, for example, as in the European Union or African Union, etc., and that unions are the size of continents, then the next scaling up of the size of political units will be of planetary size. Since there's only one Earth, one planet on which we live, this implies that we will be living in the relatively near future in a global state, that is, a political unit the size of a planet. Most of this book is concerned with the creation and the nature of such a global state, which is called globa, G-L-O-B-A, based obviously on the word global, and ending with the letter A to give it a certain similarity with the names of other political units, for example countries or continents such as America, Bolivia, Canada, Australia, Asia, etc. In this introductory chapter we do not present in detail the many